Alright, hello everybody, welcome to episode 94, I think. For anybody new, this is a podcast, so it's basically just going to be audio. Ignore the screen for the most part, it means nothing, it's just going to be still images. As always, if anybody wants to support me, PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below and at the top pinned comment. Okay, so this is a brief special episode that was actually sort of commissioned or requested by somebody. So apart from the intended offshore operations off the coast of Namibia, a large in terms of landmass, small in terms of population, southern African nation, just to the south of Angola. So the small oil company, going under the acronym RECAF, or Reconnaissance Africa, has been given complete rights to the entirety of the Kavango Basin, which is in northeastern Namibia and northwestern Botswana. And as I was asked to clarify, yes, they do have both exploration and production rights to the territory, and it is based on a 4-year term, so it will be up in 2024. So in 2024, they'll have the opportunity to renew it with the Namibian government, unless anybody else comes in, any of the larger industry corporations, and makes the Namibian government a better offer. Obviously, the larger companies have more cash to play with, so they could make an excessively better offer. But most of them are primarily interested in offshore Namibia, since it bears a similar outflow and offshore shelf setup to offshore of Angola, a country and location that's already been tried and proven, along with, granted proportionally for their individual sizes, the other coastal Central West African nations up the Central West African coast. So the bigger major companies for the moment are sticking with what's safe, with what they know is going to make them money. Granted, if this much smaller company manages to find exceedingly good indicators, then that might start piquing everybody else's interest. So the Kavango Basin up in northeast Namibia, northwestern Botswana, is up in the northwestern portion, or makes up basically the northwestern portion of the greater Kalahari Basin, which is basically interior southern Africa. As if you look at a topographical map, southern Africa, the southern third or so, basically has an entire rim of mountains surrounding right along the coastline or so, and then sort of a decent bit of higher elevation, at least in comparison to the basin itself, up to the north, sort of sealing it all in. Now granted, the interior, the basin itself, the low areas of the basin, are not necessarily low in terms of elevation above sea level, just in their general topography in comparison to, the whole rim of surrounding mountain ranges for several thousand miles that encompasses them. It is a low-lying area in comparison. Now again, to avoid any confusion, I'm not some industry insider, and I'm not a geologist or a petroleum geologist or a geophysicist or anything of the sort. So getting asked for my thoughts and opinions about stuff always kind of feels a bit weird, but regarding the whole setup, not just the Kavango Basin, but the whole southern African area, the whole interior Kalahari Basin, in regards to whether or not I think it actually does hold any petroleum or any hydrocarbons, yes, probably, but more than likely not as much as a more low-lying, similar geographical setup of the same kind, so that's more open or ocean-connected. Granted, the greater Kalahari Basin does, in the surrounding mountain periphery, have a few breaks in the chain, or a few points that would have allowed for massive water intrusion during catastrophic events of the past. As for anyone who's unaware, oil and gas are aquatic-based in terms of how they're formed, or how they were formed. They're ancient dead sea life, for the most part ancient dead algae and phytoplankton, when you had massive sudden algae and phytoplankton die-offs, and such a great accumulation of that dead aquatic biomass would all fall to the ocean floor during some kind of catastrophic event where it would be buried by sediment before it could be consumed, either usually, not always, but usually in a couple of primary types of setups. The first being mostly closed off, really low-lying, large low-lying areas One of the best examples being the Persian Gulf and the whole surrounding Arabian Basin area, and the other frequent one being a gradual sloping delineation down away from near-ocean mountains into the ocean, the kind of setup being found offshore of Namibia and Angola, also Brazil, and the north slope of my own state of Alaska, where basically all of Alaska's oil has been. So the Kalahari Basin does have the semi-low-lying basin setup, but it actually, at least at first glance, has too little open access, sort of too few access points. But yes, I do feel like there still probably is a decent bit of something there. Regarding the supposed claims about the Kavango Basin, there's been a general misunderstanding of geologists supposedly claiming that it likely has as much as or more oil than Texas. That's, for one, not actually the case in terms of what they said. And secondly, even if it were, that would be extremely delusional, because primarily it's not part of the same kind of highly favorable setup. What was being said by some geologists is that they believe it may have as much oil in the form of shale as the Eagle Ford Formation in Texas, and Eagle Ford estimates vary, but they're generally between about 8 and 16 billion barrels, and of the few estimates I've seen for the Kavango Basin, they are within that general range, usually 8 to 18 billion barrels potentially. There have been some excessively extreme claims, but they fall into the same category as other excessively extreme claims, like the Gulf of Mexico still containing another 300 billion barrels of oil, or Somalia supposedly having 1.8 trillion barrels of oil. Absurd claims are absurd for a reason, because they're absurd. Plus, most of the extremely excessive or extremely generous resource claims about the Kavango Basin aren't coming from outside sources, they're coming from the drilling company themselves, so that always should raise a bit of a flag. I believe I was also asked if the Kavango Basin could get up to 8 million barrels a day. I believe that would be in reference to if it was as big as Texas, quote-unquote, or had as much oil as Texas, which wasn't the geologist's claim. The claim was that it was about the size of Eagle Ford in terms of how much oil it potentially held in shale. So the ultimate answer is no. Even if it was the same as Eagle Ford, then it would hold the potential about the same as Eagle Ford, which would be to get up to, at its highest point, Eagle Ford got up to about 1.8. If Kavango has the same, or maybe a little bit more, it might be able to get up to about the same range, maybe 2. But again, that would be really highly dependent on just how similar it was in setup, in terms of how similar the shale actually was to the Eagle Ford shale, because the Eagle Ford shale was a really nice setup and was easy to develop. Because again, just the presence of oil, if there is something there, or the presence of shale, doesn't mean that it's actually going to be worth something and is actually going to go anywhere for you. Reference, per se, the epic failures of the Monterey Shale in California and the Antrim Shale in Michigan, and the just now emerging failures of the UK onshore shale formation. So if it has a similar excellent setup as the Eagle Ford shale, and if it has a relatively similar amount, then it could potentially see numbers along the lines of Eagle Ford's production if as much was put into it to produce as quickly, which would not be possible because Eagle Ford was in Texas, and a colossal gargantuan amount of oil-related infrastructure obviously already existed and exists all over, every square inch of Texas. So a huge amount of needed stuff was kind of already there and present for developing shale in Texas, and actually in most parts of the U.S. where shale has been developed. So if the Kavango Basin turns out to be similar to Eagle Ford, it would be capable of similar degrees, but it would not be able to simply fly up there in production numbers that fast. Now, even a lack of infrastructure can be overcome to a certain extent, not actually completely overcome, just it can be made a bit less of a hurdle if you're going all in, full steam ahead, like, for example, the developments in Guyana. However, those are mostly being done by large oil corporations like ExxonMobil and Hess. But again, also, like I mentioned at the beginning, if RECAF finds anything indicative in the Kavango Basin, then large oil companies could potentially come in and make the Namibian and Botswanan governments, much larger offers than RECAF could make. Could the Kavango Basin go rocketing up from 0 to 2 million barrels per day in, such a short time as Eagle Ford did, of like a few years in the late 2000s? Unfortunately for Namibia, no, because again, Namibia isn't Texas. It's not, a giant puzzle board of oil infrastructure that already exists. And the Kavango Basin is pretty decently, far out there. So you'd also have to do a lot of long-range stuff, set up, the export terminals on the coast. But again, for a short frame time reference, over in Guyana, from the first major offshore discoveries there, back in, I have to call the 2010s, the previous decade now, they were able to get production up and going in a little over 4 years. But again, even though offshore, that was still conventional oil, and also they didn't really have to cover, even though it was undersea pipeline, they didn't have to cover that much distance. And also fracking requires a lot of water. I hope anyone would know who's familiar with it. Since shale is not conventional oil is, from a large enough pocket of ancient dead marine life that was compressed and is in a decent enough volume in a small enough, relatively small enough space of porous rock to where it's basically a highly pressurized reservoir that you can puncture. Whereas shale is when the whole process was a lot more fragmented. The dead groups were likely split and scattered and fragmented up, and or compressed into not as porous rock. Obviously, the worst factor being when you have both going against you. So you have to pressurize and blast water down there after drilling to fracture the rocks and pressurize the oil out, since you're in an either or and scenario, because you're having to either or both provide artificially the porosity by fracturing the rocks and provide artificially the pressure by then continuing to pump that highly pressurized water through there. So shale requires a lot of water, which for deep interior Namibia in the Kalahari, that's kind of an issue, because the Kalahari region and the Kavango Basin being within the Kalahari region, that's not exactly a lush river-laden, Amazon type scenario. It's kind of a desert. At least that particular region of it isn't exactly a desert, but but in shale terms, with how much water shale needs, it's basically a desert. So even though there's a lot of great potential sort of indicated by the whole thing, it is facing some pretty decent uphill battles, even if stuff is discovered. Now, that's obviously also not ruling out there being conventional oil there. However, their general thinking is primarily shale. In terms of what they actually know so far, they only as of the moment have the general topography and geology. They only as of the moment have done magnetic surveying, which is okay, but that's not enough. You need to actually general area by general area do actual full-scale seismic surveying, which is when you use either ground-pounding trucks or in many cases explosives, and you have seismic sensors placed all about the surrounding area, picking up the different reflections of those extreme vibrations coming off of whatever's in the ground below you, and that's what really lets you detect differences and anomalies that you then target and drill test wells into, which leads into what I believe one of the other questions was, which was how much can you know about X land area, which I assume was the land area of the entire Kavango Basin based off of 3 test wells. That math should work itself out. That would tell you nothing. The way you're really supposed to go about the testing is after you've done all of the different kinds of surveys, especially the seismic surveys, then you pick and select, the best looking geological anomalies that you believe are most likely reservoirs or potentially productive areas of a shale formation, and then you drill test sites into those particular areas that you've singled out and see what kind of data you get from the well. But regardless, you have to do all that first and then select those potential areas and then drill test wells in those areas to see if something's there, if it's what you thought was there, and then determine the qualities of what is there if something is there. And then after that, in terms of actually developing and producing it, then you have to deal with all the aforementioned problems, which add up to, is the Kavango Basin going to be some kind of giant rocket launch of oil production? No. Even if there is something there, and if it is equitable to the Eagle Ford Shale Formation, it's almost certainly not going to play out the same way. There's a lot of hype, apparently, and a general really decent rule to go by is never buy into the hype. Don't dismiss the thing that the hype is about, but don't buy into the hype. So, yes, Kavango Basin probably does have some fair amount there. No, it's not going to come rocketing up as some super oil juggernaut. But like with everything else, I always could be wrong. But that's my whole summation and overview of the whole situation. So I hope that was satisfying enough to the person who requested it. Thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below. Only support if you actually can. But may God bless and protect you all, and I will see you all around next time.